They called it the golden age of reggae. But gold gets buried. The 70s were the most creative decade in Jamaican music history, and most of it never left the island.
Police and thieves in the street.
Think you know 70s reggae? You know what the record labels wanted you to hear, what they buried, what they let disappear. That's what this video is about. 10 albums, flawless.
Tribal war in a Babylon. It's simple.
Forgotten. One of them was rejected by a major label. Today it's called a masterpiece. This countdown starts now. Number 10, Junior Murvin, Police and Thieves. Recorded in 1977 at a studio that felt more like a sacred space than a room with 4 walls. Close your eyes and imagine a Kingston night in the hot summer of 1977. The streets are tense. There is a heaviness in the air that only people who lived through that time in Jamaica will truly understand. And then this record comes on for a falsetto voice, high and haunting, cutting right through the noise like a blade. This is not dance music. Yeah, this is music that tells the truth. Junior Murvin, born Colin Murvin in Port Antonio, Jamaica, recorded this album with the legendary producer Lee "Scratch" Perry at his famous Black Ark studio in Washington Gardens, Kingston. Perry was at the very peak of his powers. The album came out on Island Records. The title track spoke directly to the chaos on Jamaican streets. Police and thieves facing off while ordinary people caught in the middle tried to survive. It was raw, it was real. And then something remarkable happened. The Clash, the British punk band, heard that title track and covered it on their debut album the same year. That connection between Jamaican roots music and British punk said everything about how powerful this record was. Here's something most people don't know. Lee Perry's Black Ark was not a fancy studio. It was a small, cluttered, almost chaotic space in his backyard. Perry mixed potions, painted symbols on the walls, and believed deeply in the spiritual power of the music he made there. When Junior Murvin sang in that space, Perry said the whole building vibrated. He called it a miracle session. When The Clash covered the title track, most of the attention went to the cover version, not the original. The full album barely got noticed, and people heard The Clash's version and never went looking for where it came from. You know, that is one of the quiet tragedies of the reggae business in that era. Artists gave the world something beautiful, and the credit went somewhere else. Day by day. Junior Murvin gave us one of the most emotionally powerful vocal performances of the decade, and most people still don't know his name. Stay right there, because number 9 is another Black Ark masterpiece, and the story behind it involves an artist everyone tried to write off. Number 9, Max Romeo, War in a Babylon. Released in 1976, and this one carries a story of redemption that still gives me chills. This album feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at everything wrong with the world and deciding to speak about it anyway. It is heavy. It is spiritual. It is roots reggae at its most defiant. The bass sits low in your chest, and the Rastafarian fire in Max Romeo's voice does not ask for your permission, and it just enters you. Max Romeo, born Maxwell Livingston Smith in St. Dacre, St. Catherine, Jamaica, had a complicated history before this record.
A man's pride shall bring him low, yeah.
Back in 1968, he had a huge hit called Wet Dream, a song that got banned by the BBC and branded him as a novelty act. People dismissed him. They thought he was just a joke. But Max Romeo had depth that those people never bothered to find. War in a Babylon, produced by Lee Perry at the Black Ark and released on Island Records, completely destroyed that dismissal. Like track after track, he preaches, warns, challenges. The album spoke about political violence, spiritual warfare, and the fight for the soul of Jamaica. The track Chase the Devil from this album was later sampled by The Prodigy in their 1994 track Out of Space.
Many miles away, yeah, in this kind of
Introducing Max Romeo's voice to an entirely new generation who had no idea they were listening to a roots reggae masterpiece from Kingston. He gave that new audience something they didn't even know they needed. Now, Island Records promoted Bob Marley hard at the same time this album dropped. The label had limited resources and limited attention. War in a Babylon got caught in the shadow of a giant. It was not bad luck, it was business, and the business did not serve Max Romeo the way his talent deserved. He came back from being called a joke and made one of the finest albums of the decade. That takes courage, that takes real artistry. Now, don't go anywhere. Number 8 brings in a trio of voices that together created something so soulful, it will stop you in your tracks.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. What? Check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
Number 8, the Heptones, Party Time. 1977, and yes, the name is a little misleading. This album is far deeper than a party. Imagine a late night in a Kingston neighborhood where families sit outside on their verandas and the music drifts down from an open window, warm, human, full of love and longing in equal measure. That is what Party Time feels like. It is soulful reggae, the kind that makes you feel something right in the middle of your chest. The Heptones, Leroy Sibbles, Nalberry Llewellyn, and Earl Morgan were already legends of the Studio One era in the late 1960s. Leroy Sibbles was the bass voice of Studio One, one of the most influential people in Jamaican music history. By 1977, the trio walked into Lee Perry's Black Ark and left with this album.
Come on, everyone. Yeah.
Perry captured something rare, 3 voices that knew each other so well they almost breathed together. The harmonies on this record are not just beautiful, they are architectural. Every part fits perfectly. The Island Records released it, and it went almost nowhere commercially. Leroy Sibbles left the Heptones shortly after this record and moved to Canada, where he continued his career largely away from the reggae mainstream. Many fans never got the chance to see the group that made this album perform together live. The record stands as a kind of last testament to what that trio could do at their very best. The album fell between 2 worlds. One, it was not roots heavy enough for the serious Rastafarian crowd who wanted political fire in 1977. And it was too deep and complex for the pop crossover audience, so it belonged to nobody's marketing plan. In the music business, when your record doesn't fit a box, it gets left on the shelf. Party Time deserved to be in every collection. Instead, it sat quietly for decades, waiting for people with good ears to find it. Number 7 is where things get truly extraordinary, and there is a story about one song that reportedly brought an entire island to a standstill. Number 7, Culture, 2/7's Clash. 1977, and this album came with a prophecy. This music sounds like a warning from somewhere ancient. Joseph Hill's voice has a quality that feels like it is coming from the very roots of the earth.
I take a ride sometimes until
Serious, certain, unmovable. The rhythms are heavy and slow and deliberate. When you put this album on, you feel like something important is being said, because it is.
and sometimes I write and must exchange it too.
Culture was Joseph Hill, Albert Walker, and Kenneth Days from Kingston, Jamaica. Now, the album was produced by Joe Gibbs and Errol Thompson, known in the business as the Mighty Two, and recorded at Joe Gibbs' studio in Kingston. The title track made a prediction. It said that when the date July 7th, 1977 arrived, that is July 7th, 77, the biblical prophecy of Marcus Garvey would be fulfilled and catastrophic things would happen. And on that day, according to multiple accounts from people who were there, large parts of Jamaica came to a near standstill. Shops closed. People stayed home. The country took the prophecy seriously. The day of July 7th, 77 passed without the apocalypse, but the fact that an entire nation paused because of a reggae record tells you something extraordinary about the relationship between this music and the people it came from. No other genre of music in the world had that kind of power over its audience at that moment in history. Hardcore reggae fans know this album deeply. But outside of that world, in mainstream music history, it barely gets mentioned. The prophetic intensity of Joseph Hill's lyrics made it a difficult sell to international audiences who did not share the cultural and spiritual context. Distribution was limited, and the record never got the major label push it deserved. 2/7's Clash is one of the most spiritually powerful albums ever recorded in any genre. That is not an opinion. That is a fact for anyone who sits down and really listens. You keep watching. Number 6 takes us somewhere completely different. A young man, a children's instrument, and a sound unlike anything Jamaica had ever heard. Number 6, Augustus Pablo. This is Augustus Pablo, 1974. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. This man was 19 years old when he made this record, put this album on late at night, I mean very late, when the house is quiet and everything outside has gone still. Because this music belongs to that silence. It is slow, meditative, and strange. There is a Far Eastern quality to the melodies. Like this music was reaching towards somewhere far from Kingston, and somewhere ancient and cold and beautiful. And the sound carrying all of that? A melodica. A small plastic instrument most people associate with primary school classrooms. Augustus Pablo, born Horace Swaby in St. Andrew, Kingston, was signed to the Aquarius label and produced by Herman Chinloy. Chinloy recognized something in this teenager that most adults would have missed. Pablo took the melodica, an instrument nobody took seriously, and turned it into the defining voice of Far East-influenced roots reggae. This debut album is eerie and meditative and unlike anything else being recorded in Jamaica at the time. It opened a completely new space in the music. Augustus Pablo went on to have a deep and lasting influence on dub music, and his style of melodica playing became its own subgenre. Producers and artists from around the world studied what he did. Yeah, but most people who love his later, more famous work have never gone back to this debut record, where it all began. In a Kingston studio with a teenager who heard music that nobody else could hear yet. This debut came out on a small label with limited reach. Pablo's later work on Channel One and his own Rockers International label got more attention. This record got left behind in his own discography. His fans moved forward and forgot to look back. 19 years old. And he made something this fully formed, this original, this strange and perfect, that deserves to be celebrated. Number 5 is a record that helped invent something that would change music globally, and almost nobody gives it that credit. Number 5, Big Youth, Screaming Target.
No, you don't say no.
1973, this is sound system music, the kind that fills a yard in Kingston on a Saturday night, the bass hitting the zinc fence, Big Youth's voice riding over the rhythm like he owns the entire sky. There is electricity in this record, an energy that feels spontaneous, like anything could happen next, because in 1973, anything could. Big Youth, born Manly Buchanan in Kingston, Jamaica, was a disc jockey in the original Jamaican tradition. He toasted over rhythms, told stories, threw out social commentary, challenged the system. Screaming Target was produced by Keith Hudson and is widely recognized by music historians as one of the first full-length DJ albums in the history of reggae music.
You should go to school and learn the... No.
Big Youth was the bridge between the old-school sound system toasters of the 1960s and the artist DJ model that would define Jamaican music for decades and eventually directly influence the development of hip-hop in New York City. Yeah, we are halfway through. Which album has hit you hardest so far? Drop it in the comments below. Some music scholars have drawn a direct line from Big Youth's vocal style, his rhythmic speech, his social commentary, his way of writing a beat with words, to the emergence of rap music in America just a few years later. The Jamaican DJ tradition that Big Youth helped build was carried to New York by Jamaican immigrants, and from there it became something the whole world knows. Now, Big Youth helped start a chain reaction he never got full credit for. By the late 1970s, the international spotlight on Jamaica was almost entirely on artists with major label deals and crossover appeal. DJ-style records, talking over rhythms, did not translate easily to Western music critics who did not understand the tradition. The format was unfamiliar. The praise went elsewhere, and Screaming Target, a genuinely revolutionary piece of music history, got left in the crates. If you love hip-hop, if you love spoken word music, you owe Big Youth a listen. This is where some of that DNA lived before it traveled. Number 4 is the darkest, most haunting record on this entire list, made by a man who built his own label because nobody else believed in what he was doing. Number 4, Keith Hudson. Flesh of My Skin, Blood of My Blood, 1974. Flesh of my skin, blood of my... And nothing on this list sounds like this. This album feels like walking alone through Kingston at 4 in the morning. Everything is dark and slow and a little bit frightening. The bass is enormous. The production is skeletal and raw. There is a quality to this music that sits somewhere between dub and pure roots. Not quite either one, or something of its own. It's something that feels ahead of its time in a way that is almost uncomfortable. Keith Hudson, born in Kingston, Jamaica, was a producer first and a vocalist second. He had already made his name producing records for other artists, including Big Youth and Dennis Brown. But this album, Flesh of My Skin, Blood of My Blood, was deeply personal. He self-produced it and released it on his own Atra label because no established label understood what he was doing. The lyrics dealt with suffering, on spiritual struggle, and the hard reality of life in Jamaica. The production was proto-roots, almost avant-garde for 1974. Scholars of reggae history have suggested that Hudson's experimental studio work directly influenced the way Lee Perry would later develop the Black Ark sound. Keith Hudson died in New York City in 1984 at only 38 years old. He had spent the last years of his life largely overlooked by the mainstream music industry while continuing to record with fierce independence. This album, his masterpiece, was made when he was still a young man with everything ahead of him. The fact that he never received the recognition this work deserved is one of the genuine tragedies of Jamaican music history. Self-releasing a record in Jamaica in 1974 on your own label meant you had almost no distribution, no support structure. You know, radio promotion.
She wanna rest. Flesh of my
The record reached people through sound systems and word of mouth and almost nothing else. Outside of a small dedicated audience, it disappeared. Deep reggae collectors found it eventually. But the wider world, even the world of reggae fans who call themselves serious listeners, largely missed this one. If you find it, do not let it go.
If only you were my
Number 3 goes even further back in time. It's a song started in 1969 that did not reach the world as a full album until years later. And the story of how it was made will stay with you. Number 3, the Abyssinians, Satta Masagana, 1976. This is one of the most spiritually significant albums in the history of Jamaican music, and most people have never heard it in full. You know the feeling when a piece of music makes you feel still inside, when not sad, not happy, just completely present and awake? That is what Satta Masagana does. The harmonies are celestial, the rhythms are slow and heavy and deliberate. This feels like music made for a sacred ceremony, not a dance floor. What it asks something of you. It asks you to pay attention. The Abyssinians were Bernard Collins, Donald Manning, and Linford Manning from Kingston, Jamaica. The title track was originally recorded around 1969 and released on their own Clinch label. While making it one of the very first self-released reggae records in history, years before independent releasing became common anywhere in the world. What made the title song truly extraordinary was its lyrics. The part of the song was sung in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. In 1969, Jamaica singing in Amharic was a profound act of Rastafarian identity and resistance. It said, "We look to Africa, not to Britain, not to America. Our roots are ancient, and they are ours." The full album was not released until 1976, and even then, distribution was deeply limited. The title Satta Masagana roughly translates from Amharic as "give thanks and praise." The phrase became widely known in Rastafarian culture, and the song itself became a kind of unofficial hymn for a whole generation of believers. But most of them knew only the single. The full album, with all its depth and variety, remained hidden in plain sight. The Abyssinians operated largely outside the commercial system by choice. Their commitment to spiritual authenticity over commercial success meant they received almost no mainstream promotion. The album was known among deeply committed reggae listeners, but it never broke through. It deserved the same reverence given to the most celebrated roots albums of the era. The only reason it did not get that is because the music industry was not listening closely enough. Number 2 is where I need to tell you something that has been sitting in the background of this whole countdown, a story about a record so good that a major label heard it and said no. I told you this was coming. Here it is. Number 2, the Congos, Heart of the Congos, 1977. And earlier in this countdown, I made you a promise. I told you that one album on this list was rejected by a major label and that today it is called a masterpiece. This is that record. And now I am going to tell you the full story. Put this album on and let your mind go quiet. The first thing you notice is Cedric Myton's falsetto. A voice so high, so pure, he's so impossibly precise that it sounds less like a human being and more like something reaching down from above Kingston to touch the music. Underneath that voice, Lee Perry's production creates a world that is lush and strange and dreamlike. This is not just a reggae record, this is an experience. The Congos were Cedric Myton and Roydell Ashanti Johnson, with Waddy Burnett also present on key sessions. They recorded Heart of the Congos at Lee Perry's Black Ark studio in 1977. At Perry himself, a man who produced some of the greatest records in Jamaican music history, later said that this album was his finest achievement as a producer. That is an extraordinary statement. Everything Perry had built at the Black Ark came together on this record. When Heart of the Congos was completed, Lee Perry brought the finished record to Island Records. Island was the most important reggae label in the world at that time. They had signed Bob Marley. Boy, they were the gateway between Jamaican music and the international market. Island said, no, there are different versions of the story, and it is important to be honest about that. In interviews over the years, various people have offered different explanations. Some say Island found the production too experimental, too unconventional for a mainstream market. Some say the falsetto harmonies were considered too unusual for Western ears. With some accounts suggest there were personality clashes between Perry and the label, Lee Perry himself gave varying accounts at different times in his life. What is documented and certain is the outcome. Island passed. Perry released the record himself on his own Black Ark label in 1977 with extremely limited distribution. Outside of Jamaica, almost nobody heard it. The Congos did not receive the international career launch that an Island deal would have given them. The album quietly disappeared. Perry's frustration with the music industry continued to grow in the years after this record. By 1979, he had burned down the Black Ark studio itself. An act that shocked Jamaica and ended one of the most creative periods in the history of recorded music. Some who knew Perry believe the rejection of this album and others like it contributed to the state of mind that led to that moment. The world finally caught up in 1996. The Blood and Fire reissue label, dedicated to recovering lost Jamaican music, gave Heart of the Congos a proper release with full liner notes and wide distribution. Critics who heard it for the first time were stunned. The Guardian, NME, and Serious Music Publications internationally called it one of the greatest reggae albums ever made. Today it appears on lists of the greatest albums of any genre from the 1970s. It took 19 years for the world to hear what Lee Perry made in that small studio in his backyard. 19 years. The music industry got that one very, very wrong. And the legacy of Cedric Myton's voice and Lee Perry's genius survived anyway, well, because great music always does.
Dub it, dub it, dub it, dub it, dub it, dub it, dub it.
And now we are at number 1. The album I believe is the most underrated record in the entire reggae canon. I want you to stay with me right to the end because this one is personal. Number 1, Burning Spear, Garvey's Ghost, 1976. This is the one. This is the album that in my mind sits above every other overlooked record from the entire decade of 70s reggae. Imagine standing in the hills of St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica at dawn. The mountains are still covered in mist. The air smells like earth and rain, and from somewhere in the distance you hear a bass so deep it feels like the ground itself is speaking. That is Garvey's Ghost. It is elemental music. But music made of the island itself. Burning Spear, born Winston Rodney in St. Anne's Bay, the very same parish where Marcus Garvey was born, recorded Marcus Garvey in 1975 with producer Jack Ruby, whose real name was Lawrence Lindo. That album is widely celebrated. It is on every serious reggae list. It is taught in universities, and it deserves every bit of that praise. But Garvey's Ghost, released in 1976 on Island Records as the full dub companion to Marcus Garvey, is something else entirely.
Marcus
Jack Ruby and Burning Spear took every track from the original album, stripped them down to their roots, and rebuilt them as pure dub. What remained was the skeleton of some of the greatest music of the decade.
Catch them, you hold them, you hold.
Drums like thunder rolling down from the Blue Mountains, bass like the earth shifting beneath your feet, ghost voices that drift in and out like spirits at a ceremony. The connection to Marcus Garvey is not just symbolic.
Oh, you got yourself.
Burning Spear grew up in the same community where Garvey was born and raised. When he sang about Garvey, he was not performing history. He was speaking about a man who was a living presence in the land he grew up in. That personal, geographical connection to one of the most important figures in African diaspora history gives this music a weight that you cannot manufacture. You either carry it or you don't. Burning Spear carried it. The reason is simple. Marcus Garvey is the famous twin. And that album sits at the center of the story. Garvey's Ghost is its shadow. And in music history, shadows rarely get examined. Dub albums in 1976 were still considered add-ons, bonus products, secondary releases. Critics and fans filed them away and went back to the main event. What they missed, and what most people are still missing, is that Garvey's Ghost is not a lesser version of Marcus Garvey. It is a different experience of the same truth. It takes everything that album said and sends it deeper into the place below words, into pure feeling, into the part of you that does not need language to understand. Winston Rodney made two masterpieces. The world kept one and forgot the other. If you have been a reggae fan for any part of your life, finding Garvey's Ghost is like discovering a room in a house you thought you knew completely, and everything inside it is extraordinary. This is the most underrated album in the reggae canon. Not a cult classic, not an interesting footnote, a masterpiece that fell through the cracks of its own twin's greatness. Do not let it fall through yours.